Now, last month's fatal shootings of 2 US citizens by Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, ICE, sparked a massive wave of unrest across America, with large-scale strikes and protests happening in over 1,000 cities in all 50 states. And these events, which are continuing, they've left me wondering what past presidents would make of it all. What past presidents would think of what's going on, what's happening. I suspect that they would be deeply divided in their opinions. Now, some past presidents have been very vocal on the issue of immigration. The most vocal president on the issue of immigration, of course, is the current one, President Trump. Other presidents have also been vocal on this issue. In his farewell address to the nation, so the final address in office, Ronald Reagan asserted that immigration kept America, and these are his words, perpetually young, energetic, and innovative. And some years before him, Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered this famous line to a room full of blue-blooded patriots. In fact, you couldn't be in that room unless you could prove that you were related to one of the original revolutionaries. So you could trace your lineage back several generations to a revolutionary. So, blue-blooded patriots. And this is what he said. Remember always that all of us, you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. He said he used the word revolutionists. It means the same as revolutionary. We use the word revolutionary. He said revolutionist. We all descended, he said, from immigrants and revolutionists. Did you know that Jesus descended from immigrants and revolutionists? Not quite the sort of immigrants and revolutionists that President Roosevelt had in mind, but immigrants and revolutionists all the same. Among the 36 men who dominate Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, which you can find in the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, of the 36 men who dominate that genealogy of Jesus, there are 5 women. 5 women. And each of those women was tainted by social stigma. But that's not what defined them. That's not what defined them. Because each one is a testimony to God's grace and an exemplar of faith in action. In fact, at least one of them is mentioned in the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. They're exemplars of faith in action. And that's never more true than in the case of Ruth, the Moabite immigrant, who in her own quiet way became something of a revolutionist. But you'll have to come back this evening to find out about Ruth, the revolutionist, or Ruth the revolutionary. Now, the events surrounding the short book of Ruth take place during a period when Israel was ruled by judges rather than kings. Now, Israel during the judges period was a very dangerous and, for most of that period, lawless place. It was like the Wild West, except they carried swords around with them rather than guns. But something like that. A very dangerous period in Israel's history, a brutal period. Now I'm going to briefly cover the first half of Ruth's story this morning, and I'll leave the rest for tonight. And I'll begin by very briefly summarizing the first 2 chapters. Now, chapter 1 opens with an Israelite family in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, famous, of course, for where Jesus was born. Also for where King David was born, where he originated. They're in Bethlehem. Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion. They're struggling to survive a famine. And in search of food, they moved to the neighboring land of Moab, which was Israel's ancient enemy. And there, the father, Elimelech, dies. And his sons marry Moabite women, because presumably those are the only women available, Ruth and Orpah. Tragedy strikes again when both of Elimelech's sons die, leaving their mother, Naomi, and her Moabite daughters-in-law alone, all alone. We don't know how or why they died, but being as this is the Judges period, it's not difficult to imagine what might have happened. With no reason left to stay, Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah that she's going back to her home in Israel. And she compels them to stay in Moab and remarry. Orpah agrees to stay. But Ruth insists on sticking with Naomi. And the 2 of them return to Bethlehem in Israel. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter. And she blames God for her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where to find food. So they've newly arrived in Israel. This is the first time that Ruth has been there. She is an immigrant at this point. They discuss where to find food. And it happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. So Ruth offers to go out and pick up leftover grain in the harvest fields. And without realizing it, she begins this hot and arduous task in a field belonging to Naomi's relative, a man called Boaz. And after Ruth comes home that day, Naomi is thrilled to find out that she met Boaz, because he qualifies to be what was known as their guardian redeemer. And the phrase guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer refers to an ancient cultural practice. If the male head of a family died, bear in mind this is a patriarchal society, if the male head of the family died, it was the redeemer's responsibility to marry his widow so she would be provided for and her family's assets would be legally protected. No one could take them away. And by the end of this second chapter, Naomi's faith in God is fully restored. It's fully restored. Now, God is barely mentioned in the book of Ruth. Yet his providence is at work behind every scene, weaving together the lives of the characters. The book doesn't explain the reasons behind Naomi's losses, but it does show the powerful ways in which God brings good out of bad. And while tragedy tempts Naomi to believe that God is punishing her, has abandoned her and is punishing her, all subsequent events in the book show a different story, that he is on a mission to restore and bless her. To restore and bless her. How does God accomplish this restoration and blessing? He does it through Ruth, the Moabitess. And as is often the case, God works in unexpected ways through unlikely people. And he does it time and time and time again throughout the Bible. And he's still doing it, working in unexpected ways through unlikely people. In the ancient Near East, the livelihood and security of women was completely dependent on the men in their families. Now, I'm sure Naomi would have been devastated when her husband died. However, she must have derived some comfort from her two sons. Not only would they care for her in the future, they would ensure that her family continued for future generations. Tragically, their untimely deaths prevented them from doing either of those two things. With no husband, no sons or grandsons, Naomi is left feeling empty and completely hollowed out. Her life drained of everything that gave it meaning. And she begins to voice her doubts about God's love, even going as far as saying, "The Lord himself has raised his fist against me." When tragedy comes our way, and it's inescapable, when tragedy comes our way and life seems unbearable, we can be left questioning God's purpose in it all. And for some of us, the questions voiced by Naomi will be painfully familiar. Why has God allowed this to happen to me? Why didn't God answer my prayers? Does he really love me? Has God abandoned me? Has God turned against me? Is he punishing me? With no male left in the family, Naomi and her daughters-in-law had no legal rights, nobody to defend them against exploitation and abuse. Their future was frightening. Now, traditional interpretations view the book of Ruth as a beautiful love story between an impoverished Moabitess and Boaz, the wealthy Israelite landowner. And these interpretations, they portray Boaz as the hero of the story, but there's a reason why it's not called the book of Boaz, it's called the book of Ruth. Now, Boaz's generosity does reverse Naomi's sagging fortunes. And though he plays a significant role in what happens, it's Ruth who is the hero of this story. She is the hero. And this becomes apparent right at the beginning, when Naomi urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families in Moab, where they would receive male protection again, where they would have the prospect of a second marriage. Did you know that in the ancient Near East, the four most vulnerable people groups, it's not that different today, were widows, orphans, the poor, and immigrants. Orphans, widows, the poor, and immigrants. Naomi knew that if her daughters-in-law returned with her to Israel, they would fall into every single one of those categories. Not only would they stand out as foreign widows, as immigrants, they would live in poverty as orphans, with no father around to provide for them or protect them. And having realized the harsh reality of the situation, Orpah kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and returns home. We don't know what happened to Orpah. She probably married. Again, she probably married a Moabite. She returns home. But not Ruth. Ruth disregards her personal safety, her future security. Instead of looking to her own interests, she prioritizes the needs of her mother-in-law. In fact, Ruth literally clings to Naomi, and solemnly promises to never leave her or forsake her. And what she says to Naomi is a profound declaration of love. She says, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." So, motivated by love, Ruth is willing to remain a widow. She is willing to become an orphan. She's willing to suffer poverty and endure the social stigma of being an outsider, an immigrant in a foreign land. Motivated by love, Ruth is willing to make herself nothing, so she can remain with and continue to support Naomi. And that was a reference to Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, by the way. Throughout the Old Testament, there are types of Christ, what we call types of Christ. People whose lives foreshadow and point ahead to Jesus. Now, Joseph is the quintessential type of Christ, but there are others. There are many others. I believe that Ruth's self-sacrificial love for her mother-in-law makes her one of the most Christ-like people in the Old Testament. And as the story unfolds, we see how far Ruth is willing to go in her love for Naomi. Now, love is a major theme in Ruth's story. And before we see romantic love blossom between Ruth and Boaz, and we'll find out a bit more about that this evening, there's a far greater love, a far more powerful love on display. It's a self-sacrificial love that goes above and beyond what anyone has the right to ask or expect. That's the love that Ruth shows Naomi. It's the same love that God has shown us in Jesus. It's the same love that God has shown us in Jesus. The Hebrew word for it is one that I'm sure most of you have probably heard of before. Is probably the most well-known Hebrew word apart from shalom. It's the word hesed, or chesed, but I'm not going to say it like that because I'll get a sore throat. It's the word hesed. In 1956, the beloved British writer C.S. Lewis, national treasure, wrote a letter to a young American writer offering the following advice. Don't use words too big for the subject, he said. Don't say infinitely when what you really mean is very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something really infinite. Now, C.S. Lewis gave some wise advice to that writer. Because words matter. And it's very easy to use hyperbole or to overstate things and exaggerate. I do this all the time. My children pick me up on it regularly. It's very easy to do, to overstate something, be overly dramatic. However, sometimes we use words that are too small. They're too small. And this is the case when translating the Hebrew word hesed. On their own, English words are too small to convey what hesed means. There's no single English word that does hesed justice. So for this reason, we have to use multiple words to convey what it means. Words such as loyal, faithful, steadfast, reliable, even covenantal. And sometimes words are combined together in order to get closer to the meaning of hesed. Steadfast loving kindness is a very common translation. So this compound word that gets a little bit closer to what hesed love is. Now, the word hesed is used only 3 times in the book of Ruth. But it's used twice to describe Ruth's actions. Twice to describe Ruth's actions, and once to describe God's love. In the book of Ruth, God's hesed love touches Naomi. And it does so through a young Moabite woman. A Moabite immigrant who fights on her behalf with relentless commitment. That's how God has fought on our behalf. He's fought on our behalf with relentless commitment. On their arrival in Bethlehem, Ruth takes on the task of providing for their small family unit. They have no food, so Ruth offers to glean. Now, gleaning was Israel's welfare system, a way for the poor to get food by scavenging. not scavenging in dustbins, but scavenging leftover grain from harvest fields. And for someone like Ruth, gleaning was a very dangerous occupation. She would be working alongside other gleaners, some of whom would be hungry enough, desperate enough to rob her of whatever grain she managed to collect. And as a young, defenseless woman, Ruth was, of course, in danger of being sexually assaulted, even by the hired laborers who were working in the fields. This was even a possibility in Boaz's field. Because later on in the story, Boaz has to instruct his male harvesters not to lay a hand on her. He reads them the riot act. Don't you lay a hand on her. He knew what the possibilities were, the things that could happen. Now, Ruth most likely entered the first harvest field she came across. She knew. She was a smart woman. She knew her safety was at risk. But she went in anyway. And if it came to it, she was willing to suffer harm for the sake of Naomi. She'd already suffered harm by leaving her homeland. And it's her willingness to suffer on behalf of someone else that makes Ruth Christ-like, that makes her Christ-like. Did you know that Jesus never once risked his life? Jesus never once risked his life. In fact, Jesus never risked anything. You see, in order to take a risk, you have to be ignorant of the future. So God cannot take a risk because, of course, he knows the end from the beginning. He knows the future. Jesus knew exactly what was coming around every single corner. Nothing whatsoever took him by surprise. He told his disciples that he was going to be crucified long before it happened. He even told them that one of their number, one amongst them, would betray him. And he told them before it took place. And he said to them, I tell you this beforehand, so that when it happens, you will believe that I am the Messiah. You will believe. When Jesus entered this world, he did so knowing full well that he would suffer at the hands of men and be lifted up on a wooden cross. There was no risk involved. There was no risk involved. There was only willing sacrifice. Willing sacrifice. Now, having noticed Ruth working amongst the gleaners in his field, Boaz is compelled to find out who she is and why she's there. And he's deeply moved when he discovers the huge sacrifice Ruth has made in order to care for her mother-in-law. Boaz is particularly struck by Ruth's willingness to leave her parents, her homeland, to leave all her previous life behind and become an immigrant, become a nothing in a foreign country. And what Ruth has done for Naomi stirs Boaz to make special provision for her. He's moved by her story. So he makes it easier for her to gather grain in his field. He provides her with food during mealtime. He goes above and beyond the letter of the Mosaic law. And he goes right to its spirit. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi that he prays there and then that God will reward her. And when Ruth eventually returns home to Naomi, there are no telltale signs of her having been mistreated or abused. Instead, she walks through the door carrying 29 pounds of winnowed barley, at least half a month's pay for a male harvester. And not only that, she presents her mother with some fast food, the leftover roasted grain from the meal Boaz had given her. And when Naomi realizes that Ruth has been gleaning in the field of Boaz, her close relative, she feels joy. She feels joy. The last time she felt joy was probably when her 2 sons were still alive. And she says of Boaz, "The Lord bless him." Now, my favorite classical composer, I don't know if my father-in-law will approve. He may do, I don't know. I'll have to ask him afterwards. My favorite classical composer is probably Beethoven. And not least because of the triumphant choral climax to his 9th symphony. Ode to Joy. Ode to Joy. You'd probably be familiar with it. Now, if you were to choose a piece of music to capture Naomi's reaction when Ruth returns, I think Ode to Joy would be very appropriate. Let me read you a verse from the poem that Beethoven based it on, because it perfectly encapsulates what Naomi says next. "Be embraced, millions. This kiss to all the world. Brothers, above the starry canopy, there must dwell a loving Father." There must dwell a loving Father. Are you collapsing, millions? Do you sense the Creator world? Seek him above the starry canopy. Above stars must he dwell. There must dwell a loving Father. And in the next statement that Naomi makes, she uses the word hesed. Remember, hesed only appears in the book of Ruth 3 times. And Naomi says this: "He has not stopped showing his kindness, his hesed, to the living and the dead." Another translation puts it like this: "May he be blessed by the Lord," she says of Boaz. "May he be blessed by the Lord," and now she's talking about God, "the Lord, whose kindness, whose hesed, has not forsaken the living or the dead." And this statement marks a dramatic turning point for Naomi. It's the moment when her faith in God is restored to what it once was. And she realizes in the depths of her soul that God loves her. That God loves her. That he'd never stopped loving her. God's love had always been with her. Even in the midst of terrible tragedy, shining brightly through Ruth, the Moabitess. Amen.